In a big sit-down interview that aired last night, President Joe Biden adopted a slightly more assertive tone on the investigation into sexual harassment and assault allegations against New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Here's what he had to say to ABC's George Stephanopoulos.
Let me ask you about Governor Cuomo of New York. I know you said you want the investigation to continue. If the investigation confirms the claims of the women, should he resign?
Yes, I think he probably end up being prosecuted, too.
Democratic strategist and founding partner at Northern Star Strategies, Michael Starr Hopkins, and co-host of the Realignment podcast, Marshall Kosloff. They join us now to discuss. Michael, let me start with you. I was pretty struck by Biden's words. He's usually incredibly reluctant in order to wade into these things. He did reiterate that he wants to wait for an investigation, but saying the words, he could be prosecuted. Now, I'm not sure if he was relating to the sexual harassment or allegations against Governor Cuomo or the nursing home scandal, which we've covered in depth here on the show, but strong words from the president regardless. What did you make of him coming out so strong from that?
So when I first heard about his comment, I was really stunned because that's an aggressive comment to make, especially someone who's been an ally to Cuomo. But when I actually saw the clip, the question is posed, if it ends up being true, should he resign? Well, obviously, if it ends up being true, then he should resign and he should be held accountable through legal means. So I don't think it's as big of a story as we initially thought it was. But look, Cuomo is in a lot of trouble. The fact that he has made enemies across the political spectrum, we're hearing more accusations every day. This isn't something that's going to go away. And it's going to be really interesting to see how Democrats handle it, especially because in New York, the majority of voters are actually polling to show that they don't want him to resign. But across the country, it's baggage for Democrats. So it's going to be really complicated. And I don't see a lot of people jumping to Governor Cuomo's aid.
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with Michael on this, Marshall, which is that, look, what Cuomo is betting on is for some time to pass, for him to be able to get out of the top of the news cycle and for people to kind of move on and for them to forget what this moment felt like when the heat and the pressure was really on. And so, yeah, while Biden is saying if the investigation reveals that these things were true, he should resign, he's still basically giving Cuomo the time that he ultimately is looking for. And look, from my perspective, regardless of what happens with the sexual harassment investigation, we already know what he did with the nursing homes, and that in and of itself is more than enough justification.
Yeah, and I think the real story here is we're just seeing how the political context on this all has changed. So if this were 5 or 6 years ago, it's easy to see Governor Cuomo resigning at this point over just this whole mass of bad news. But just because of the fact that post Al Franken in the Senate, there's just very little incentive to resign and basically concede by acclamation that the accusations are true. You're just not going to see a resignation, especially when it's been proven that the voters base, we just don't care about something like this. Like, this is part of the thing is people get more and more cynical about politics and the system and politicians. It's not going to be shocking to people if stuff like that happened. And I think the broader nursing home scandal, just the reality there is that for so many people, it just feels as if COVID was, especially the early part of COVID where that happened, is just this black hole. So that's why he hasn't suffered political consequences for that, even when, and especially when there isn't Republican opposition in the state that's capable of seizing power. That's the key part of that dynamic. Yeah, it is interesting, Michael. Look at that poll. I was checking in New York City, in New York State, where, yes, half of voters wanted him to go, but that included Republicans. If you see among Democrats, a majority of them wanted him to stay. What do you make, though, because there is a sizable contingent now. The New York Senate delegation, Kirsten Gillibrand, Schumer calling on him to resign, New York City Mayor de Blasio. I mean, can Cuomo effectively stay on in a one-party state when it's not just voters necessarily, but all of the leaders in the state are essentially calling for him to go? How does that happen?
Well, I think what the big moment is going to be is whether or not there are enough votes for him to be impeached. Mm-hmm. If he's impeached, then Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, who I always disclose is a client of mine, would step in and become the governor while he's going through the trial. I think that would be a moment where there would really be questions about whether Cuomo resigns so that he doesn't have to go through that process. But I think for Cuomo, one of the biggest problems he's having is Trump is not the foil for him right now. Previously, previously, when Trump was in office, he could always point to Trump and say, Trump has been accused of, 28 sexual assaults, and, he is the bad guy, and I'm just being unfairly accused. Well, with Trump in Mar-a-Lago and not on Twitter, he doesn't have that same ability. So there isn't someone for him to necessarily point to and say, yeah, I may be problematic, but this guy is a lot worse. And I think that's where you're seeing this vacuum around Cuomo. That, and he, has a reputation as a bully, someone who hasn't necessarily been able to bring people together, but rather through fear has been able to move up the ladder. And now we're seeing, I think, the consequences of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think Michael brings up a really good point here, which is that the worst thing for Cuomo is the fact that Trump is gone now. Not only because he has that comparison of like, well, this guy is way worse, but also Cuomo was a great foil. The media loved Cuomo as the foil for Trump, and Trump sucked up a lot of oxygen. So this story wouldn't garner as much media attention as it would then. But I also think, Marshall, one of the most fascinating dynamics here is like Cuomo and Trump are basically the same person. I mean, their personality types, their tactics, they're so incredibly similar. What does it say about the nation that both parties in this time of need like reached for this very similar sort of big authoritarian personality type?
It says, it speaks, it says a lot about New York. Let's be very precise about that. Because that's the
New York values.
There's something else. Yeah, there's something else in common there too. Let's not wrap Mississippi into it. But no, on a broader level, I think that it just reflects around the fact that the actual institutions of the party are just so, on both parties, are just so weakened. The leadership is so weakened. Like, does anyone actually care if the New York Senate delegation wants him to resign? Like, no one actually cares. Like, no one cares what statement the Democratic Party of New York says. This isn't the 1960s. This isn't the 70s. This isn't the 50s. So it just says that in a moment where everything is weak and perceived to be weak, strong men and strong women in many respects have an opportunity to be demagogic and aggressive. And you're just going to continue to see more figures like that, but you are just going to see them, frankly, and this is the post-Me Too era moment, like we're still in this moment where there were just behaviors and incidents that were tolerated, and you're going to see a new generation of politicians who are capable of being aggressive and strong in that sense, but don't also touch people in weird ways. That I think it's a real preview of what 2.0 version of this is going to look like.
Yeah, right. Just don't be creepy. Bar. Seems pretty clear. All right, guys. Really appreciate your
Great to see you both. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
All right, next on Rising, a new Amazon Ipsos poll shows 2/3 of Americans supporting a $15 minimum wage. Brianna Joy Grace is going to discuss the survey when Rising continues.